An empty highway, the clock hands frozen, a family trapped in light, 3 elongated figures waiting by the roadside. When the engine roared back to life, 2 vanished hours had already slipped away. In the summer of 1952, the town lay quietly in the flatlands of Iowa, a place where days passed with a rhythm so steady it seemed unbreakable. The cornfields spread for miles, their stalks high and green, whispering as the warm winds pushed through them. On Main Street, the rumble of aging Fords and Chevrolets carried up and down the narrow blocks, mingling with the laughter of children chasing one another near the diner. The local theater, its marquee lit with buzzing bulbs, offered black and white reels about the war that had ended only a handful of years earlier. Life appeared settled, ordered and predictable, as though it were aligned with the rigid schedule of the school bus that collected children each morning and returned them each afternoon. Yet beneath that calm surface, there were moments when the ordinary bent under the weight of something unspoken. On a warm July evening, when cicadas rattled in the trees and porch lights flickered in the humid air, the patrol officer who managed the night watch paused to make a note in the station logbook. He wrote with deliberate slowness, his handwriting steady but his face unreadable. The entry was brief, stripped of description or speculation. It stated only this: unexplained light, northwest, witnesses 2. Nothing more, no adjectives, no embellishments. A time was marked, a direction noted, and then the pen lifted from the paper. For reasons not explained, the officer left the matter there. The following morning, as the sun rose heavy and red over the flat horizon, farmers in the northern fields discovered something that unsettled them. Among acres of corn that stood upright and uniform, one section appeared strangely altered. The stalks were not broken or crushed as though trampled, nor were they burned as by fire. Instead, they were bent, hundreds of them, all arched gently in the same direction, as though some vast and silent hand had smoothed them down. The plants were alive, their leaves green and supple, their stalks moist with life, and yet they remained curved, fixed in their new posture with no sign of returning upright. The ground beneath was undisturbed. There were no tire marks, no footprints, no machinery tracks. The soil was firm, the roots intact, the earth carrying only the scent of dew and the faint trace of fertilizer. It was as though the plants themselves had been persuaded to bow by some pressure that did not leave a mark. When sunlight touched them, the bent rows glistened with an odd sheen, as though the surface of each stalk had been rubbed until it reflected more than it should. The farmers who stood around the patch were not men prone to exaggeration. They were used to storms that tore roofs from barns, to plagues of locusts that darkened skies, to droughts that cracked the soil. They knew the language of natural disaster, but what they saw did not belong to that vocabulary. The stalks were too uniform in their bending, too clean in their arrangement, as if shaped by design. One man remarked quietly that the curve of the plants resembled the arc of a compass, sweeping out from an unseen center. Another traced his hand along a stalk and felt no weakness, no break, only a firmness that resisted his effort to straighten it. Word spread with the pace of rural gossip. By afternoon, several curious townsfolk arrived, each taking their turn to walk among the bowed stalks. Some whispered of wind shears, though no storm had passed the night before. Others wondered about pranksters, but there were no broken stems, no clumsy signs of human interference. A few mentioned the strange note from the police log, though no one could explain how light in the sky might bend plants in the soil. At the edge of the field, a young boy noticed something that the adults overlooked. On a patch of dirt between the rows, the dew had collected in small beads, yet the beads formed perfect concentric circles as though water itself had obeyed a pattern invisible to the eye. When the boy tried to call attention to it, The marks had already begun to fade beneath the strengthening sun. By midday, they were gone. Agronomists from nearby counties visited in the following days. They examined samples of the stalks, cutting them with knives, peeling back the husks, holding the fibers up to the light. Their reports were cautious, written in the same stripped-down manner as the police entry. Structural integrity normal, chlorophyll levels within expected range, no evidence of disease or pest. And yet one line in the margin carried a note that was never meant for the public. Internal tissues appear stressed as if compressed from within. The phrase lingered, raising more questions than it answered. If a force had acted from the outside, why were the roots untouched? If heat had been applied, why were there no burns? If weight had pressed down, why had the stalks not snapped? The silence of the explanation became the hook, a detail that refused to dissolve into the comfortable routine of Midwestern life. Evenings returned to their usual rhythm. Families sat on porches listening to the night insects. Automobiles rumbled down the two-lane highways, and the theater lights glowed faintly against the dark. Yet in the back of every conversation, there hovered the image of the bent field, green and growing but shaped by something unseen. It was a quiet disturbance, subtle but enduring, a reminder that order could be broken without warning, and that sometimes the land itself carried the weight of mysteries no one could name. And in the margins of the town's records, beneath the normal entries of thefts, accidents, and lost property, remained the brief note dated the 12th of July. Unexplained light northwest, witnesses 2, a line so bare it could have been overlooked, yet heavy with suggestion, as though behind those few words stretched a depth of silence that no report could contain. The stalks in that field continued to grow through the rest of the season, their ears filling, their tassels spreading, their roots drawing water from the soil. But none of them straightened. Each one remained bent at the same angle, alive but altered, like a memory that refused to fade, fixed permanently by a force both invisible and undeniable. 1 week after the bent corn was first noticed in Iowa, a separate record appeared hundreds of miles away in Nebraska. The entry came not from a farmer's notebook or a rural police log, but from the guarded files of a United States military installation. The airbase sat low against the prairie, its runways stretching like black scars across the flat ground, lit by a handful of beacons that pulsed through the summer haze. Beyond the fences, the land was empty for miles, only wheat fields and silos breaking the horizon. Within the chain-link perimeter, the night followed its rigid order. Watch rotations, fuel checks, hangar inspections, and the constant hum of generators feeding electricity into the barracks and control towers. On the evening of July 19th, the radar operators took their usual positions in a low concrete bunker near the center of the base. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Each man wore headphones and stared into the dull green glow of circular screens, waiting for the routine pattern of commercial flights, cargo planes, and the occasional military test craft. For long hours, the blips appeared and faded just as they always did, moving across the grid with measured speeds that matched their filed flight plans. Then, just after 10, one operator leaned forward and tapped the glass of his display. The radar had caught something irregular. A trace appeared against the northwest edge of the screen, faint at first, then growing sharper. It carried no identifying signal, no transponder code, no registration. In ordinary terms, it was nothing more than a moving dot. Yet the way it moved set it apart. It advanced against the prevailing wind, climbing with a speed that no jet of the early 1950s could achieve. The blip shifted in irregular bursts, vanishing for seconds, then reappearing further along its course, as if the radar itself hesitated to acknowledge its presence. The operator marked the position on his log sheet with a pencil, writing only object without signal. His supervisor, standing behind him, instructed silence and restraint. No alarm was raised, no pilots were scrambled. Instead, the men in the bunker continued to watch, breathing quietly, noting each appearance of the phantom target. Their short notes would later form the skeletal outline of an archived report, careful in wording, cautious in tone, but preserving the essential fact. Something unknown had passed across their instruments. Outside on the runways, the ground crews went about their inspections. The air was cool, the prairie wind sliding against the wings of parked fighters. Mechanics carried lanterns and flashlights, moving in pairs as they checked fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Yet an undercurrent of tension spread after a coded call reached the maintenance office. The order was simple but unusual. Prepare the interceptors, hold them at readiness, and wait. No explanation followed. The men obeyed, rolling tool carts, checking ammunition belts, and standing back from the planes as if waiting for an unseen signal. Along the fence line, the security patrol shifted its pattern. Guards walked slowly beneath the towers, their boots crunching on gravel, their rifles hanging heavier than usual in the dark. Some paused to scan the horizon. It was then that a few of them noticed the light. Far to the northwest, beyond the farmland and the low hills, a pale glow hovered against the sky. It was not steady like a star, nor flickering like an aircraft beacon. Instead, it resembled a vast white beam, a spotlight suspended in emptiness without a lamp to cast it. When one of the men lifted the rangefinder toward it, the number spun and dropped to 0. The device insisted there was nothing to measure, as though the glow did not exist in any measurable sense. For several minutes the light remained, shifting slightly, then dimming, until at last it melted into the blackness. The guards said little. They recorded the time in their notebooks and continued their patrols. The quiet discipline of the base demanded it. Yet in the hangars, whispers carried between mechanics, men who had glimpsed the horizon glow through the open doors while tightening bolts on engines. Each one described it the same way, a brightness without a source, visible but ungraspable. The strangeness of that night did not end with the light. In the maintenance depot, where batteries were stored on heavy wooden shelves, 4 units failed without warning. Each had been fully charged the previous afternoon, tested and marked with chalk. Now, within a span of minutes, every gauge dropped to 0. The indicator needles hung limp against their stops. Technicians tried replacement leads, swapped meters, even checked the wiring of the shelves, but nothing explained the sudden collapse. No acid leaks were found, no damage to terminals. The cells looked intact, yet they held no power, as if the current had been drained by an unseen hand. The report filed in the early hours of July 20th described the failure with detached language. It used the phrase anomalous drop in potential. No conclusion was drawn. The entry closed with a note that the batteries were to be destroyed and replaced, their remains not to be repurposed. The order was unusual, but it was carried out without protest. The following day, the base resumed its routines. Aircraft taxied and lifted from the runways. Trucks rolled in with supplies. The radar screens once again displayed the ordinary traces of scheduled flights. Yet the memory of the unexplained object remained, tucked into logbooks, sealed in typed summaries and carried silently by the men who had watched the light drift across the Nebraska sky. The phantom left no wreckage, no debris, no sound, only the records of machines that insisted it had been there and the testimony of guards who swore they had seen something that by all measures should not have been seen at all. The field reports, sparse as they were, joined the growing stack of classified files. None were circulated beyond the base. None were discussed openly in the mess halls or barracks. Still, the details lingered like static in the back of the mind. The motion against the wind, the impossible acceleration, the glow that refused measurement, and the drained batteries that fell silent all at once. That silence was the hook that held the story in place, an absence of explanation that refused to fade. For the men on duty, it was a reminder that even within the guarded boundaries of a military installation, there were forces that moved unseen, capable of touching instruments, machines, and nerves with equal indifference. And in the flat prairie night of 1952, the air base kept its watch with a quiet unease, waiting for the return of whatever had passed beyond its fences. In August of 1952, the heat of summer still lingered across the Midwest, clinging to the air even after sundown. On the evening of August 10th, a young family drove north along Highway 61, returning from a late visit with relatives. The highway stretched before them in long, empty ribbons of asphalt, flanked by fields of corn and patches of woodland that rustled faintly in the warm night breeze. The dashboard clock crept toward midnight. Few cars passed on that road at such an hour, and the quiet gave the journey a dreamlike quality, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic flicker of the headlights across the reflective markers at the road's edge. The man at the wheel was weary but alert, his eyes scanning the horizon for the faint glow of a roadside diner or gas station. When a series of lights appeared in the distance, hovering low above the road, his first thought was of neon. Perhaps a late-night cafe, perhaps the red and blue glow of a service station sign buzzing against the dark. The lights shimmered with an intensity that seemed inviting, a soft promise of coffee and respite before the final miles home. But as the car rolled closer, the shapes of letters never formed. The glow did not resolve into tubes of glass or the flicker of bulbs. Instead, the illumination seemed suspended in the air itself, without poles, without structure, without wires to hold it. 4 luminous orbs hung silently above the asphalt, arranged in a line that paralleled the horizon. They pulsed faintly, as though breathing. The man pressed his foot against the brake, but the car resisted in a way that defied understanding. The engine continued to run, its low mechanical thrum steady, yet the wheels no longer turned forward. It was as if the vehicle had pressed into an unseen barrier. No jolt, no impact, only an implacable halt that froze it in place. The steering wheel grew stiff beneath his hands, the pedals heavy beneath his feet. A tremor passed through the frame of the car, not mechanical but atmospheric, like the vibration of air before a storm. Inside the cabin, the lights from the road poured through the windows, bathing the family in a pale glow. It was not like the beam of headlights or lanterns. Instead, the illumination seemed to penetrate from every direction at once, leaving no shadow in the car's interior. The needles of the dashboard instruments froze in mid-motion. The fuel gauge stopped its subtle sway. The clock on the dash froze at 12:27. Even the faint tick of the second hand halted, suspended in place. In that suspended glow, the woman turned her gaze toward the passenger window. Along the edge of the road, just beyond the guardrail, stood 3 figures. They were elongated, their forms too tall for the proportions of men. Their arms hung unnaturally long, the hands nearly reaching their knees. They did not move, did not sway, did not gesture. They stood in stillness as though posed, their outlines blurred by the strange light. No features were visible, no faces to distinguish, only silhouettes pressed against the glow like shadows cast backward from a hidden flame. A heaviness spread through the car, a sense of pressure that was neither heat nor weight, but something in between. The air seemed thick, resistant to breath, each inhalation dragging as though through water. The silence pressed deeper than natural quiet, muffling even the engine's idle vibration. The children in the back seat shifted uneasily, their small movements dulled as though slowed by an unseen current. Time itself altered in that moment. The man later recalled glancing at his wristwatch, expecting the usual progression of minutes, but the hands remained fixed, just as the dashboard clock had frozen. The absence of movement, the absence of sound gave the scene a quality beyond dream, more absolute than nightmare. There was only stillness, a suspension in which the ordinary rules of motion and time held no sway. Then, without transition, the barrier lifted. The car lurched forward as though released from a grip. The engine coughed once, then smoothed into its steady rhythm. The headlights once again pierced the road, revealing the empty black stretch ahead. The glowing orbs above the highway had vanished. The figures along the roadside were gone. The family sat in silence as the vehicle rolled on, none daring to speak, each gripping the residue of what they had seen. When at last the father glanced at the dashboard clock again, his breath caught. The hands no longer pointed to 12:27. They now marked 2:45. His wristwatch confirmed the same time. More than 2 hours had passed since the moment the car had halted, though by the family's memory, no more than 10 minutes had slipped by. The mile markers along the roadside told the same impossible story. The car had not moved far. The odometer recorded only a fraction of a mile gained. In the records of that night, there was no report filed, no call made to authorities. The experience remained only within the family, etched into their private recollection, retold in fragments and whispers. But the strangeness of Highway 61 lingered. The impossible stall of a car that still ran, the light that cast no shadow, the figures with arms too long, and the vanishing of hours into silence. Each detail became a hook that refused to release its hold. The missing time stood as the most unyielding mark. 2 hours and 18 minutes unaccounted for, dissolved into the fabric of night, leaving only the memory of light and the press of stillness that had stopped the world upon an open road. By late August of 1952, the family's quiet attempt to bury their experience gave way to pressure from neighbors and relatives who had noticed the strain written into their movements and their silence. After nights of broken sleep and mornings clouded with unease, the husband drove to the small sheriff's office on the town's main street. He entered hesitantly, carrying no evidence except his account. The deputies listened, their faces stiff, before drafting a report that reduced his long and halting testimony to a handful of sterile lines. The wording was cautious, stripped of conjecture. Unexplained lights, vehicle malfunction, missing time. Witnesses, 4. Normally, such accounts would have remained in a drawer, a curiosity soon forgotten. But the year was 1952, a season already charged by sightings scattered across the Midwest. The report did not die in the county archive. Instead, it was forwarded quietly to a regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Within a week, 2 men in pressed suits arrived at the sheriff's building. They asked no questions of the deputies beyond the basics, then requested the husband appear for further examination at the nearby Air Force installation in Nebraska. The summons was not framed as optional. A government sedan arrived at the family's farmhouse before dawn, its presence heavy against the gravel drive. The husband entered the back seat and was driven past endless fields until the hangars of the base rose against the horizon. There he was guided into a windowless building lit by harsh fluorescent lamps, its walls bare except for a flag and a clock that ticked with deliberate authority. The interrogation began not with words but with wires. Technicians fitted electrodes to his chest, arms, and fingers. The polygraph machine, a complex arrangement of needles and paper rolls, stood beside him like a mechanical witness. Each answer he gave, his name, his occupation, the date, was marked by the scratching tremor of pens across the moving paper. When the questions turned to the night on Highway 61, the lines held steady. The needles did not quiver. No sign of deception registered. Each time he repeated the details, the stalled car, the lights in the air, the figures by the roadside, the machine traced smooth, unwavering paths, as if conviction itself had hardened into steel. Observers noted the anomaly in silence. Normally, the charts showed some human variation, a flicker of doubt or hesitation. Here there was none. His certainty seemed absolute, mechanical in its precision, as though he were not recalling an event but transmitting something fixed, unchangeable, like a message inscribed into his memory by another hand. The examiners conferred in hushed tones but pressed no accusation. The results were logged in the detached language of bureaucracy. Subject displayed absolute consistency. No indications of fabrication detected. Following the polygraph, a medical officer led him into a narrow examination room. Under the glare of a lamp, his forearms were inspected. Thin lines ran across the skin, pale and shallow, yet with edges too crisp to be dismissed as scratches. They crossed at near perfect angles, forming a faint lattice like the imprint of heated wire. When touched, the man winced. The physician noted that the marks resembled burns, yet the skin was neither blistered nor broken. Instead, it bore the look of something etched, as though heat had brushed across the surface without charring. The officer photographed the patterns, measuring their span, before bandaging the arms loosely and recording the injuries as unexplained dermal impressions. Meanwhile, his wife underwent a quieter examination in another wing of the facility. She reported a persistent ringing in her ears, a high tone that had not ceased since the night of the encounter. She described her inability to sleep, the way her body lay tense as though awaiting some signal, her mind caught between waking and dream. When a doctor shone a beam of light into her eyes, the pupils failed to contract immediately. For several seconds, they remained dilated, sluggish, before narrowing belatedly against the brightness. The physician repeated the test again and again with the same result. He recorded the phenomenon as delayed pupillary reflex, cause undetermined. The children, though spared direct interrogation, were also examined. Their vitals were stable, but both appeared unusually fatigued. Their movements slow, their eyes heavy, even in daylight. The physicians noted no outward injuries, only a shared lethargy that resisted easy explanation. Back in the interrogation chamber, the husband was pressed to recount his experience once more. The men in suits stood impassive, their notebooks filling with terse lines. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, repeating the same sequence of events. His voice carried no tremor. Each detail emerged as though etched into memory. The glowing orbs, the immobility of the car, the frozen clock, the figures at the roadside. The interrogators offered no judgment, no reaction. Their silence was heavier than skepticism, more deliberate than disbelief. After hours of questioning, he was released, his escorts guiding him back into the daylight that seemed harsher than when he had entered. The base receded behind him, its fences and guard towers shrinking into the horizon. No explanation was offered, no assurance given. He returned home carrying the marks on his arms beneath fresh bandages and the echo of machinery that had declared him truthful beyond ordinary measure. The hook of the chapter remained fixed in the memory of that test. Polygraph results were rarely absolute, yet in this case the pens had drawn unwavering lines as though the man's account bypassed the usual frailty of human recall. It was as if he had not merely remembered but relayed, as if speaking through a channel set by something outside himself. The examiners filed their reports, but the implications lingered beyond the pages. The machine had spoken, and its verdict was not ordinary truth, but a certainty that carried the weight of something alien. By the first days of October in the year 1952, the slow creep of autumn had settled across the Midwest. The air grew sharper at night. The skies stretched clear and brittle above fields where harvest dust lingered. In that season, radio hobbyists across Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska began to record disturbances that did not match ordinary atmospheric noise. At first it seemed no more than static, a faint rustle carried across the shortwave bands. But soon the pattern became unmistakable. The interference took the form of a steady rhythm, measured and insistent, like the pulse of a human heart translated into sound. Each beat fell evenly against the hiss of background noise. Listeners described it as neither mechanical nor natural. It was too regular to be dismissed as thunder or solar activity, yet too organic to resemble the known clicks of military transmissions. The pulse repeated for hours, always strongest in the dead of night, between midnight and 4 in the morning, before fading as dawn approached. Operators adjusted their sets, twisting dials, swapping antennas, changing bands, yet the pulse persisted. On the narrow bands where ham conversations normally passed in bursts of coded chatter, silence fell each time the signal pressed through. Some tried to record it on tape, aligning reels carefully to capture the sound, but when they played the spools back, nothing remained. The pulse was absent, erased as though it had never existed. Stranger still, the physical reels showed damage. The oxide coating of the magnetic tape appeared thinned, as if eaten away. Technicians noted a faint discoloration where the beats should have been, as though the signal itself consumed the medium rather than preserved itself upon it. Reports circulated quietly in radio clubs. Handwritten notes described the same phenomenon in towns separated by hundreds of miles. One man in Kansas claimed the pulse interfered with his set, even when he switched the power off. Faint vibrations trembling in the metal casing, as if the air itself carried the rhythm. Another in rural Missouri insisted that the sound matched his own heartbeat, quickening when his pulse quickened, slowing when he calmed, before vanishing altogether. Away from radios, motorists began to notice disturbances on a particular stretch of highway near the Missouri-Iowa border. At mile marker 23, any car that approached found its AM broadcasts swallowed in a burst of noise. The interference was not ordinary static. It surged in dense layers, overwhelming every frequency at once until the dial became a wall of sound. Travelers described a heaviness in the atmosphere when they reached that point, as though the air itself thickened. Some compared it to the silence before a thunderstorm, when clouds gather and the hairs on the arm lift in warning. Accounts collected by a local mechanic told of headlights dimming slightly, though the engines of the cars never faltered. Radios, however, fell silent in unison, stripped of every signal. Once drivers moved beyond the spot, reception returned instantly, clear as before. The location became known among truckers who passed through at night, many choosing to switch off their sets before reaching it, unwilling to endure the oppressive silence that seemed to press upon them in the gap. As the nights grew longer, the disturbances increased. Farmers waking before dawn reported hearing faint humming in their barns, though no machine was running. Dogs in rural yards barked through the dark hours without cause. Families who lived near the troublesome mile marker claimed that, on several nights, the glow of their radios continued even when unplugged, the vacuum tubes emitting a dull light as though charged from elsewhere. Then came the newspaper clipping that fixed the matter in the memory of the region. On the morning of October 17th, the local daily printed a small column buried near the classifieds. It carried a plain headline, "Unusual lights reported over St. Paul's Cemetery." The brief note stated that several residents had seen luminous shapes over the cemetery grounds in the early hours, moving slowly above the gravestones before vanishing into the night sky. It added that neighborhood dogs had howled until sunrise, their cries carrying through the streets. The report ended with a final detail that unsettled even the skeptical. At dawn, townspeople who entered the cemetery found the grass marked by circular patches of scorched earth. Each was nearly 4 meters across, their edges crisp and precise, as though seared by heat that left no flame. The burned rings stood out against the frost that had settled overnight, dark wounds in the pale lawn. No explanation was offered. The clipping was brief, factual, and ended without speculation. For the radio hobbyists who had logged the strange pulse for weeks, the timing was unmistakable. The cemetery lights appeared on the very night when the signal had been loudest. Those who had tried to record it on tape swore that their reels had failed entirely in those same hours. For the motorists who knew the silence at mile marker 23, the burned circles at St. Paul's Cemetery seemed only another extension of the unseen force that pressed upon the region. The chapter's hook lay not in the noise itself, nor in the erased recordings, but in the quiet testimony of the earth. Grass burned into perfect circles, a pattern that spoke of intention, not accident. The newspaper offered no theories, but the images of the scorched patches lingered in the minds of readers, tying together the rhythm on the radios, the heaviness in the air, and the spectral lights above the graves. The interference was no longer confined to static or tape. It had left its trace upon the ground itself. By the closing months of 1953, the files stored in military archives had swollen into thick bundles. What began as isolated notations, brief log entries, local police reports, hand-sketched maps, had grown into a collection of several hundred pages bound with red twine and stamped with heavy black ink. Each folder carried the label Anomalous Incidents, though no consensus had been reached on what the incidents represented. Inside the files, photographs showed circles burned into grasslands, their edges sharp, their diameters measured precisely in meters and feet. The scorched earth stood in stark contrast to the frost that surrounded it, patches of black embedded into pale fields. Other pages contained transcriptions of radio logs, attempts to capture the rhythmic pulse that hobbyists swore they had heard across the shortwave bands. Engineers appended diagrams of circuits and waveforms, yet admitted in footnotes that the original recordings had failed, leaving only silence on reels that should have been filled with sound. Maps filled with pins and marks extended across the Midwest, linking towns in Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri. Each marker denoted a place where interference had been reported, where strange lights had been seen, or where unexplained burns had scarred the land. The lines connected in patterns that resembled corridors, as though unseen routes passed beneath fields and highways. Analysts shaded these areas cautiously, noting clusters but refusing to declare them paths. The language of the reports was careful, stripped of emotion, but the tension pressed through the lines. Internal experts, drawn from aeronautical divisions and communications bureaus, admitted that no known aircraft matched the behaviors described. Balloons drifted with wind, yet the lights described moved against prevailing currents. Jets of the early 1950s lacked the acceleration and silence reported by witnesses. Meteorological phenomena might explain flickers in the sky, but not circles etched into earth with mathematical precision. The phrase unidentified aerial phenomena appeared in the documents with increasing frequency, each time hedged by caution, but always present. Despite the accumulation of data, the files were sealed. The classification strictly confidential was stamped across covers later elevated to top secret. Access narrowed to only a handful of officers and analysts. Civilian witnesses were urged to withhold their accounts, their credibility questioned in subtle ways, their reputations managed to discourage further speech. When local newspapers pressed for answers, official statements offered simple explanations: weather balloons, atmospheric disturbances, reflections of light. Behind closed doors, however, the contradictions deepened. The final hook of the archive emerged not from maps or burned soil, but from the medical reports attached to a single family. The parents and 2 children had been examined repeatedly after their encounter on Highway 61. Most results were unremarkable, though lingering fatigue and nervous strain were noted. Yet in the last file, dated December of 1953, a physician recorded an anomaly during routine tests. Under ultraviolet illumination, one of the children's eyes displayed an unusual phenomenon. The irises glowed faintly, a ring of luminescence that pulsed once before fading. No known condition matched the effect. The physician described it as a fluorescence of the iris under non-visible spectrum, unexplainable by normal biology. The entry was marked Special Observation. No follow-up explanation was ever appended. The pages ended abruptly with that notation, leaving the impression of a case suspended mid-sentence. The child was placed under quiet medical supervision, though the details of what that entailed never surfaced. The family's file closed with a single phrase handwritten at the bottom: "Subject requires continued monitoring," and then the record stopped. The broader archive, sealed and hidden, preserved photographs of scorched earth, maps with unexplained clusters, and charts of erased radio waves. It preserved the testimony of pilots, farmers, and civilians who had spoken of lights and stillness, of missing time and heavy air. It preserved medical notes of burned skin and delayed reflexes. Yet it offered no resolution. By the end of 1953, the official voice fell silent. Outside, in the towns and farms where the events had first occurred, the fields returned to their cycles, radios once again filled with static and music, and roads emptied of late-night disturbances. Yet for those who had glimpsed the archive, the silence was heavier than any answer. The report ended without conclusion. No acknowledgement, no denial, only the locked cabinets of a military archive and the lingering unease of details that resisted erasure. The story terminated with the glow of a child's iris under invisible light, a brief pulse caught in a medical file and never explained. What remained were traces: scorched grass, silent reels, and the absence of sound where once the ether had carried a heartbeat rhythm. The unanswered report left its weight not in explanation but in omission. It was the silence of corridors unexplored, of records sealed, of phenomena observed yet never resolved. And it was in that silence that the mystery endured, untouched by the closure